Hello guys, in this video we'll learn how to manage our service configurations using console. In a previous video on my YouTube channel, we discussed how can we read configurations or service metadata using toml file. If you haven't watched that video, it should be popping somewhere on right top. First make sure you watch that video. So we added environment specific file, a separate file for configurations of dev environment, a separate file for configurations for production environment. Now we also learned how can we read like more environment specific configurations, but as you guys can see, still we have our production configurations. We don't have secrets literally, but we have username, brokers, Kafka username, and these might not be the things that we want to push as part of our code to our repository. And we might have like things like API key, client IDs, which are for internal usage. Let's say I call notification service, it requires an API key or a client ID. Then it's not a good practice to add the production configurations in your code. For that reason, we'll be learning about Hashicorp Consul today. Consul is basically a service networking platform developed by Hashicorp, and KV or key value pair is basically a feature that Consul provides where you can add your service configuration or metadata and read it on fly. That's exactly what we'll be learning today. So we'll move all of our configurations that we have for production. For dev, it's fine to be here, but for production, we'll move it to console and we'll literally delete this file. And when our service starts or builds in release mode and starts, we'll basically read the configuration from console. Now the next question that may come to your mind is, how can we connect to console? How can we spin up console? So as always in my videos, we'll be adding a Docker Compose file to spin up console. In a Kubernetes environment, you can run console as a sidecar, obviously with some mounted volume. So your data is persisted, your key value is persisted. But here we'll be running as part of our Docker Compose, and then we'll also review or get an overview of console UI. How can we set our secrets or our configuration metadata from dashboard, and we can access in code. And then, as I mentioned, we'll remove this file config prod and we'll read all of our secrets from console or configuration from console, and we'll read and access and see how it is work. So make sure you hang tight and watch till the end and understand. This is really important when you are working with microservices. So I'll be using the same project that we used in a previous video where we learned to read configurations from toml file. Since most part we'll be reusing, so move to the project explorer, and in the root of your project add a docker compose YAML file to spin up console. So version is, let's say, 3.8, services, console, and image I'll be using console 1.15.4. You can check the latest version on Docker Hub depending on which is compatible with your system, and container name as console. In most cases you can just use the same image, it will be fine, but depending on if you are watching this video later in the future, then you can always check on Docker Hub. So we'll spin up on the default port and bind on that port, and we'll add a volume console data, let's say, to console/data, and let's define a volume console data. So open your terminal and let's spin up console. We'll just do docker ps. We don't have any container up and running. Docker compose up, and as you can see we have volume and container everything up, and we can just do docker ps. There you go, we have our console up and running. Now let's go to any of our favorite browser and we get an overview of console. So here you go, the first look of console UI, and we have different other features that we'll be using in upcoming videos since we'll be working on microservices. So there are intentions, nodes. As you can see, we just have one node which is on localhost and itself is the leader, and you can get the overview, servers and all different things, but we'll be using key value as the feature we are interested today, where we can basically add our configurations or metadata for services. So here we'll just press create. Now we can dump all configurations here, or we can have a proper setup which enables other microservices in future add the same as well. So we'll follow good practices. So we'll just add services as a path, and you can always end a path with a slash and then name of your service. So let's say the name of the service that we are working on today is order service. You can have different name, but I'll just name it order service, and then config. So once we have all of this, then we can have, let's say, database. So this will be the database config, which is basically the config which is this one. So now we'll one by one move database, Kafka, logging, and discovery, all of these to console, and then we'll move to the access and reading part. So let's move back to our browser. So for database, we have we can use different formats here. So as you can see, we have JSON, HCL, YAML, or XML. I'll be using JSON. So we have username, and we can directly set the username to the same as in our config on local. So, and then we have timeout as, let's say, 10,000. Now if you have different fields you can add, but I'll just stick with these two and press save. Now as you can see, we have services. Inside we have order service, inside we have config, and in config we have database config. Similarly, let's add for Kafka. Now since we are already on the base path, as you guys can see here, we can just add the name, the key basically, and let's add the Kafka config. So there we have our Kafka config, the brokers, users, topic. Let's say you have another field which is in future, let's say client ID, and you can just add it here. So for me, I'll just stick with the current configuration that we have, save it. Similarly, the next one that we have is, let's say, logging. So we add the logging config as well, we save it. Similarly, we have the last one, which is discovery. So we can add discovery. So similarly, we can add for our discovery. Now in future, we'll also learn how can we use console for service discovery as well, but that's a future concept that we'll learn in a separate video. And again, if you have more fields, you can just add it here and save. So as you can see, our base path now looks something like services slash order service. Why we added services is just for best practice. Let's say tomorrow you have another service, you can just add inside services, then config, and maybe you have some metadata, so I added config as a folder as well, and then all these. So it's easier to change as well. You just go to the console and change it. Obviously it should not be accessible outside your infra, so that's a networking concept that we'll learn another day, but for now you can place your configurations here. And now let's get back to our ID and learn how can we access it in code. So back to our ID, move to the cargo toml file. We'll be adding a few dependencies. Console, since we'll be using console client, and JSON, since we are using JSON on console for our configurations, and base64, since all the values that we read using console client will be encoded, so we have to decode it before deserialization. These are all the dependencies that we need. Toml will still keep for dev environment, and then move to the project explorer. In the root of src, add a console reader. Now here we'll add the logic to retrieve and read all the configurations metadata that we have on console. So first of all, we'll just add a struct console reader, and we'll use client, console client, impl console reader, and create a new client. So pub fn new self, let config is equals to config, Now this is not from our create config, this is the config from console. So we'll just use it and unwrap. Then we'll just create client new and pass the config and console reader client. Now you might be wondering where have I passed the URL, but default config, when we use new, the default config points to HTTP localhost 8000, since we are just on local. But if you have data center specific, you can. By the way, console also provides replication as well. And then client, we are not using any token. Otherwise, if your service is injected with any token for console, any bearer token, you can just provide here JWT token. And if any wait time, I'll just stick with the default. And we have our new client function. Similarly, we'll add a get config. So here we'll just quickly add a get config that gets self, and the return type is of our create config, the config that we have, right? This one. So in the reader, we can just do let kv pairs and query metadata that we'll not be using. And we'll just do self dot client dot list. There is a get as well if you want to get exact path config like slash database, but since we want to get the root, so we'll just do services order service config slash and options as none unwrap. So we get our pairs. Now we'll just add a default config object, and here we'll set database to none, Kafka to none, logging to none, and discovery to none initially. And for kv pair and kv pairs that we have, we'll just add engine general purpose standard, and let's return this config so the error is gone at least. Okay, so this is basically from the encoding base64 that we added. Now you can build your own general purpose encoder as well, but we'll be using the standard one. So we can just do standard and let decoded value engine dot decode and kv pair dot value dot unwrap. Now this one you can print out as well. This is basically encoded value, so that's why we need to decode it first. And decoded str string from UTF-8 and decoded value unwrap. And if we have any unscaped JSON, then just for safe side we can also add decode str dot trim matches and replace with slash so just to have clear JSON. And once we have unscaped JSON, we can just do is kv pair. Now this is one of those ways to read. There can be tons of ways to deserialize this dynamically and different other ways, but I'll just use the safe way for now. So database config will just do serde JSON from str unscaped JSON dot OK, and we'll add else if, and then copy everything that we have here, and we'll just say if it's not database, then is it Kafka config, then set to Kafka, and else if it's not a Kafka config, then is it a logging config, then we'll set to logging. Else if it's not Kafka, not login, then it can be discovery config, so we'll set to discovery. And so this is all that we have. Else if now in future you decide to add more, you can just extend else here, and basically once you add your new field here, let's say discovery, in future you decide to add client IDs, so optional client ID, and then in the reader you just need to add a if. So this could be more optimized as well, which we'll do in some future videos, but for now let's keep it simple and basic. We read our config here, so this is all that we need in reader. Now let's make some changes in config. Now here in our code, let's make some changes to, instead of reading from our config prod toml, we'll read from console. So let's rewrite, it's better, self, and we'll just do if cfg debug assertions print running in debug/dev mode, and we can just directly read the content. So fs read to string, and config that dev.toml and unwrap, and then we can just do toml from str and content unwrap or else error, and here we can print ln saying fail to parse config, and we can print our error, and then we can have config that says database as none, Kafka as none, and logging as none, discovery as none, and actually we just return it, and otherwise we give an else which just says running in release mode, and right here we'll just do let reader console reader new and reader dot get config. So as you guys can see, for production we are reading from console, for dev mode we are reading from our dev file. Let's also delete this. So we just delete our config prod file just to ensure that we'll not be reading from there. And let's open our terminal. In main, actually we already have the code to read and display the config, as you guys can see. So open the terminal, and here we'll just do cargo run release wait. Okay, as you can see, we have our config, which is all from our console. Now let's go to console, make some changes, and then rerun. So on our console, let's say in the database, we change it to secure code user, and timeout we change to, let's say, 7000, and then we save it. So back to our ID, and we run again, As you can see, the user is changed, the timeout is changed, and we could literally change the config without pushing to our repo. So we no longer have to commit our production config on code. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you guys learned some new concepts.